A house divided. When Daniel first suggested that his mother move in with us, I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Mom's getting older," he said, his voice calm as if he were merely stating the weather. "She's been feeling lonely since Dad passed away, and it's not safe for her to be living by herself." I paused, staring at him across the breakfast table, searching his face for signs that he was joking. But there was no humor in his eyes, only a deep sincerity that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel the tension creeping into my shoulders, and I put down the pot before I spilled something. "Daniel, we've talked about this," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Your mother and I, we don't exactly see eye to eye." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that I recognized as a sign of his frustration. "I know, Sarah, but she's my mother. She doesn't have anyone else. It's just until we figure something more permanent out. Please, for me?" It was the way he said it, pleading, almost desperate, that made me pause. Daniel rarely asked for anything, especially not like this. Our marriage had always been built on a foundation of compromise, but this felt different. It felt like a line was being drawn in the sand, and I was being asked to cross it. Reluctantly, I agreed. After all, how could I refuse the man I loved? But as the days passed and the reality of the situation set in, I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. Margaret moved in on a dreary Monday morning, the sky overcast and the air thick with humidity. I stood by the front door, watching as Daniel and the movers unloaded her boxes from the truck. Margaret herself arrived in a cab, stepping out with the kind of dignified grace that only someone of her age and experience could muster. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored suit that seemed more appropriate for a boardroom than for moving day. "Sarah, dear," she greeted me with a thin smile as she approached. "I hope this isn't too much of an imposition." "Of course not, Margaret," I replied, forcing a smile. "We're happy to have you here." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I swallowed it down, knowing that it was necessary to maintain peace. The first few days were awkward, to say the least. Margaret settled into the guest room, but it quickly became apparent that she intended to have a much larger presence in our home. She began rearranging the furniture, commenting on my housekeeping, and offering unsolicited advice on everything from cooking to gardening. It felt like she was slowly encroaching on every aspect of my life, and no matter how hard I tried to set boundaries, she always found a way to cross them. One afternoon, I came home from work to find her reorganizing the kitchen. Pots and pans that had been in the same place for years were now stacked in different cupboards, and the spice rack had been completely rearranged. "What are you doing?" I asked, unable to hide the frustration in my voice. "Oh, just making things more efficient," she replied, not even looking up from her task. "I noticed that you were storing the baking sheets in a rather inconvenient spot, so I thought I'd help." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Margaret, I appreciate the help, but I like things the way they are." She finally looked at me, her expression a mix of surprise and condescension. "I'm only trying to make things easier for you, dear. There's no need to be so defensive." That was the first time I felt the cracks in our fragile truce. I wanted to argue, to tell her that this was my kitchen, my home, and she had no right to change anything without asking. But I knew that would only lead to more tension, and the last thing I wanted was to create a rift between Daniel and his mother. So I bit my tongue and let it go, even though it felt like I was slowly losing control of my own life. As the weeks turned into months, the tension between Margaret and me continued to build. Every interaction felt like a test, and I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next comment, the next criticism. Daniel, caught in the middle, seemed oblivious to the strain. He spent more time at work, leaving early and coming home late, and when he was home, he was unusually quiet. I knew I needed to talk to him, to tell him how I was feeling, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to sound like I was complaining, or worse, that I was trying to drive a wedge between him and his mother. But the longer I kept silent, the more isolated I felt. It all came to a head one rainy evening in November. I had spent the entire day at work, dealing with demanding clients and a mountain of paperwork, and I was exhausted by the time I walked through the door. I was hoping for a quiet evening, maybe a glass of wine and a good book. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Margaret was there. Standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. The smell of something burning filled the air, and I noticed that the pot was scorched on the bottom. "Margaret, is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. She looked up, her face flushed with frustration. "This stove is impossible. I can't get it to work properly." I stepped closer, realizing that she had accidentally turned on the wrong burner. The soup was boiling over, and the pot she had meant to heat was still cold. "Let me help," I offered, reaching for the controls. But instead of stepping aside, Margaret slapped my hand away, her eyes blazing with anger. "I don't need your help, Sarah. I'm perfectly capable of cooking a simple meal." That was the breaking point. All the frustration, the resentment, the sense of being pushed aside in my own home. It all came flooding out. "Margaret, this isn't working," I said, my voice shaking. "You're taking over everything. I can't do this anymore." She stared at me, her expression hardening. "You're just being dramatic. I'm only trying to help. But clearly you're too insecure to accept it." The words cut deep, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. This isn't about being insecure. It's about respecting boundaries, and you've crossed every single one. By now, Daniel had entered the kitchen, drawn by the raised voices. He looked between us, confusion and concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Margaret snapped, turning back to the stove. "Sarah is just overreacting, as usual." But I couldn't hold back anymore. "Daniel, I can't live like this," I said, my voice trembling. "This house doesn't feel like ours anymore. It feels like I'm a guest in my own home." Daniel looked at me, and for a moment I saw the understanding in his eyes. But then he turned to his mother, his expression softening. "Mom, maybe we should talk about finding a place for you. I know you want to help, but Sarah's right. This isn't working." Margaret's face hardened, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. "So you're choosing her over me?" Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't about choosing sides. It's about making sure everyone is happy." But Margaret wasn't listening. She stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Daniel and me standing in awkward silence. That night, we talked. Really talked. For the first time in months. I told him everything I'd been feeling, all the resentment and frustration that had been building up inside me. And to my surprise, he listened. He didn't try to defend his mother or brush off my concerns. Instead, he acknowledged how hard this had been for me and admitted that he'd been avoiding the issue because he didn't know how to handle it. "We'll figure this out," he promised, taking my hand. "We'll find a way to make this work for both of us." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of difficult conversations and tough decisions. We met with Margaret and discussed options for her living situation, eventually deciding that an assisted living community would be the best choice. It wasn't easy. Margaret was resistant at first, but eventually, she came to see that it was the right decision. The day she moved out was bittersweet. As much as I had struggled with her presence in our home, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as we said goodbye. Margaret wasn't a bad person, and I knew she had only wanted to be close to her son. But sometimes love and good intentions aren't enough to overcome differences. As Daniel and I stood in the now empty guest room, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The tension that had hung over our home for so long was finally gone, and in its place was a renewed sense of peace. But there was also something else, a deeper understanding between Daniel and me, a bond that had been strengthened by the challenges we'd faced. We had learned a lot during those months. about each other, about ourselves, and about what it meant to build a life together. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we had come out stronger on the other side. And as we sat down together in our quiet, cozy living room that evening, I knew that we would be okay. We had faced the storm and come through it, and now we were ready to move forward together.